In central Colorado, roughly 40 miles west of Pueblo, sits a semi-rural necropolis. Despite its smaller size, taking up only about 16 square miles, it's relatively well known, not just in Colorado, but nationally, and not always for the best reasons. That is Cañon City. It goes by a few different nicknames, like the climate capital of Colorado for its relatively mild weather, or the gateway to adventure due to its proximity to the Royal Gorge and a seemingly endless amount of outdoorsy type things to do. But it's also known for some of its less pleasant features, like for having one of the highest crime rates in the state, or for being surrounded by 15 prisons, one of which is the infamous maximum security federal prison, ADX Florence, or even for being a stronghold for the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. But while on the surface it's clear that Cañon City's got its work cut out for it when it comes to fighting crime while simultaneously encouraging tourism, it has a much, much larger problem. One that simmers just below the surface and just out of sight. One that's poisoned numerous people for 6 decades, and one of which the scope and severity still, to this day, aren't adequately studied or understood. This is the story of the former Cotter Uranium Mill and the crisis it's causing at Cañon City. Today, an estimated 5.8 million tons of toxic radioactive waste still sits all but unattended at the former Cotter Uranium Mill, a little over 3 miles south of Cañon City and directly bordering the neighborhood of Lincoln Park. And while some maintenance and minor remediation has been performed in an attempt to contain the waste, there is still no plan to clean it up, nearly 40 years after being declared an EPA Superfund Site. Instead, cleanup efforts have been, and continue to be, constantly derailed at the intersection of broken government bureaucracy, institutionalized corporate psychopathy, and a highly suspicious rabbit hole of private financial dealings. Meanwhile, what's left of the site's aging, hastily constructed infrastructure continues to leak and spill, further increasing the threat to nearby residents, many of which have been suffering the direct consequences of this mill since it opened in 1958. But how did this happen? How is it that, with everything we now know about nuclear waste, a region home to over 21,000 people is still facing this type of creeping, chronic toxicity? Well, to best understand how it got to this point, who's ultimately responsible, and what the future holds for this region, we'll need to head back nearly 80 years, to a time when geopolitics and geological science collided to create a new first for humanity, a destroyer of worlds. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first nuclear weapon ever used in warfare on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing up to 150,000 people and ushering in a swift, brutal, and highly controversial end to the Second World War. Powering that 15-kiloton atomic bomb was a relatively modest 64 kilograms of this stuff, uranium-235. The dropping of Little Boy on Hiroshima, as well as Fat Man on Nagasaki 2 days later, revealed to everyone on the planet, for the first time, the unfathomable power and destructive potential of nuclear energy. Humanity collectively looked on in a mix of shock, disgust, and fear. But for some, the introduction of this new source of existential dread carried with it, paradoxically, hope and a new path for the future. And one of those measured optimists was the same man ultimately responsible for the first wartime use of the bomb. On August 1st, 1946, just a week shy of the 1-year anniversary of the first bombing, President Harry S. Truman signed into law the Atomic Energy Act. The act established the Atomic Energy Commission, an independent civilian-run agency tasked with controlling and overseeing developments in atomic technology. For the first time, U.S. civilians had a hand in the nuclear materials industry. But in only a few short years, this budding private industry would get another, much larger and much farther-reaching boost.
I feel impelled to speak today in a language that, in a sense, is new.
On December 8, 1953, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower delivered his highly controversial Atoms for Peace speech to the United Nations General Assembly. In his address to the UN, Eisenhower attempted to calm the fears of the public while encouraging peaceful uses of uranium and calling on nations to create a centralized global stockpile of nuclear material in pursuit of a nuclear energy-focused future.
It is not enough to take this weapon out of the hands of the soldiers. It must be put into the hands of those who will know how to strip its military casing and adapt it to the arts of peace.
It is now known that Eisenhower's speech was part of a homeland propaganda campaign, codenamed Operation Candor, a polarizing and emotionally stirring campaign that drew both intense praise and equally intense criticism. Regardless of the ultimate motive, the campaign was, at least at the time, effective, and what became known as uranium fever took root. With the door to the nuclear materials industry now open to civilians, and the subsequent call to globally stockpile nuclear materials, many private companies sprang up and propelled themselves headfirst into thorium and uranium operations. And among those fortune seekers were a few men down in the American Southwest who weren't about to miss their chance to bite off a piece of what was being hailed as the next gold rush. Except in this rush, the gold could bite back. In April 1956, the Cotter Corporation, a new mining and milling company, was incorporated by 3 men out of Santa Fe, New Mexico. In one of their earliest public statements, Cotter announced they held claims to land in the vicinity of Cañon City, Colorado. While their original aim was to treat thorium mined and sent by rail from the Wet Mountains, a small mountain range in central southern Colorado, they quickly pivoted to uranium mining and milling, after securing a contract with the Atomic Energy Commission, who had agreed to pay Cotter a set price of $8 per pound of concentrated uranium. 2 years after their incorporation, in April 1958, Cotter began rapid construction of the mill just a few miles south of Cañon City and completed it in only a few short months. With the newly and hastily constructed mill now in operation, workers began processing uranium ore hauled in by rail and truck. By the end of that same year, they had already processed 7,700 tons of uranium ore, largely and woefully unaware of the troubles ahead. The goal of the Cotter Mill was relatively straightforward. Break down raw uranium ore, produce a concentrated form of uranium, commonly referred to as yellowcake, and then sell that yellowcake to the Atomic Energy Commission. While there are a few different methods to extract uranium from ore, Cotter employed a process called alkaline leaching from its opening until 1978. Alkaline leaching is a form of processing where uranium ore is crushed into a fine sand and mixed into an alkaline solution, typically sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, or baking soda. The solution is then heated and pressurized to assist with leaching the uranium from the ore. The uranium dissolves into the liquid and the crushed ore sinks to the bottom. The resulting uranium-bearing liquid then gets a dose of sodium hydroxide, which raises the pH and separates the uranium from the liquid solution. It's then dried, washed, and packed, resulting in yellowcake. While Cotter's uranium extraction and concentration process was a technical one, requiring scientific expertise and careful measurements, their waste disposal process was anything but. The fine sand that resulted from crushing the ore, called tailings, contained uranium missed during processing and radium, a highly radioactive metal that's formed by decayed uranium. The tailings also contained a variety of other metals and metalloids, like molybdenum, vanadium, selenium, iron, lead, and arsenic. The leftover liquid solution, called raffinates, contained much of the same as the tailings, along with the chemicals used in a leaching process. Cotter dumped both the tailings and the raffinates into 11 different open-air impoundments on the property, essentially just massive holes in the ground. But of those 11 impoundments, only 3 had any protective lining. The other 8 impoundments, referred to as the Old Ponds area, were unlined, meaning they were dumping toxic, radioactive waste directly into unprotected soil. And in 1965, a series of storms caused significant flooding. The Old Ponds area overflowed and carried radioactive waste from the site through the neighborhood of Lincoln Park and dumped it directly into the Arkansas River. To prevent this type of spread in the future, the Soil Conservation Service built a flood control dam and later on added a system that pumps back any water it catches to the primary impoundment. While the act of processing uranium created real-time hazards of its own, primarily to the mill workers, Cotter's waste disposal method is where the real long-term hazards truly took root. And to further complicate things, it wasn't just their own waste they were disposing of. Over the nearly 5 decades the mill was in operation, Cotter carted in toxic tailings and raffinates from various operations all around the world, from Chicago to the former Belgian Congo. But the most high-profile waste that Cotter brought in was formed by none other than the same creation that violently birthed global nuclear awareness. In 1968, Cotter received shipments of waste from the St. Louis-based pharmaceutical company Mallinckrodt. Mallinckrodt was the primary processor and provider of much of the uranium and plutonium used in the Manhattan Project, the 1940s top-secret research and development effort that created the atomic bomb. Cotter reprocessed waste from that project to extract remnant uranium and dumped the remaining waste and byproduct into the existing impoundments. It's unclear how much off-site waste Cotter brought into Cañon City, or what those transactions looked like. But what is known is that this was not an uncommon practice for Cotter, and may have helped bring in additional revenue in the wake of a dwindling uranium market. In 1978, Cotter's radioactive materials license was up for renewal. However, the EPA, in reviewing the site's history and waste disposal practices, strongly warned Colorado officials against renewing it. In a letter to the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, the EPA stated, quote, "The Cotter Uranium Mill, both existing and proposed, presents a number of significant environmental and public health concerns, and that if the Nuclear Regulatory Commission were in charge of that renewal, that, quote, the proposed Cotter operation would be environmentally unacceptable." But for reasons we'll get into later on, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment had the ultimate authority on that renewal, not the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the EPA, and Colorado officials pushed it through, despite severe opposition from both residents and federal regulators, and evidence that Cotter's activities posed an ongoing threat to public health and the environment. So Cotter's license was renewed, their activities continued, and, as predicted, the threats posed by the Cotter Uranium Mill continued to mount. For the first 22 years of operation, Cotter had disposed of their mill waste into their 11 impoundments, with only 3 of them lined. But from 1981 to 1983, they moved 2.2 million cubic yards of tailings from the unlined impoundments into a double-lined secondary impoundment. Cotter's waste disposal practices, especially during the first 2 decades of operation, resulted in a few different kinds of contamination and methods of spread, the first and most obvious being the groundwater. As water seeps into and runs through the impoundments, it carries with it contaminants from those impoundments, including uranium, radium, molybdenum, selenium, iron, lead, and arsenic. That groundwater then migrates further north underground through to the nearby Lincoln Park neighborhood and into the river. Contaminants also spread through the air. As the impoundments are open air, radon gas from decaying uranium enters the atmosphere. Typically, this is not a major concern when the concentration is low, but decaying radon can attach to dust particles and blow downwind, filling the air in and around people's homes with radioactive dust. As it turned out, Cotter had built their mill and processed uranium in one of the worst and most cleanup complicating locations. This site sits uphill, upwind, and upstream, not just from residents in Lincoln Park and Cañon City, but from one of the longest bodies of water in the United States, the Arkansas River. Groundwater to the north has to be continuously captured and pumped a mile south, back to the impoundments, and air quality has to be continuously monitored for radioactive dust, diverting resources from active remediation efforts to monitoring, maintenance, and management. And as we came to better understand the hazards of uranium processing, the waste it produces, and the effects it can have on human health and the environment, regulators determined it was finally time to get more involved. In 1984, the United States Environmental Protection Agency declared the Cotter Uranium Mill and Lincoln Park a Superfund Site, a designation the EPA gives to land contaminated with hazardous materials that pose a threat to human health and the environment. A Superfund is a legal designation by the EPA under the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, or CERCLA. CERCLA law provides the federal government the authority to force companies responsible for the release of hazardous material to clean up the land that they've contaminated and minimize the threat of further contamination. While there are some sites that require immediate emergency responses, many Superfund sites enter an extended cleanup phase in a series of long-term remedial response actions, all of which is overseen directly by the EPA. However, when it comes to radioactive material, federal regulatory oversight can operate a bit differently depending on certain agreements in place with the state. And in 1968, Colorado became one of those states, referred to as an agreement state, meaning that state regulators, specifically the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, or CDPHE, are in charge of directly overseeing the radioactive materials regulations and licenses and the CERCLA process rather than the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Environmental Protection Agency acting as the primary regulators. With all Superfunds, regulators have the authority under CERCLA to pursue the company or companies responsible for contamination, what they refer to as potentially responsible parties or PRPs, in order to pay for cleanups. And a PRP can be any entity that had a hand in activities on that land, including owners of leased out land. When it comes to the Cotter Uranium Mill, the Cotter Corporation did not initially own the land themselves. Instead, they had been leasing the land from the state of Colorado. That is, until 1983. Just a year before the site was declared a Superfund, Cotter purchased the land they were leasing from the state. While the reasoning behind why the state wanted to sell the land is not public record, the general speculation is that Cotter was forced into this position due to the state of Colorado's desire to limit their own liability and avoid being labeled a partially responsible party. Now, Cotter would have been a PRP regardless of land ownership, but the state could potentially get out from under that direct liability, acting solely as regulators for a radioactive waste site rather than being forced into the awkward position of pursuing themselves as a PRP. Despite being declared a Superfund site, Cotter Mill would continue to operate intermittently. But with the Superfund declaration comes an extra level of regulatory scrutiny, one that Cotter wasn't exactly thrilled about, and they would make it clear over time that they had no intention of operating in good faith. Since the opening day of the Cotter Mill, contaminants from its activities and waste began spreading to nearby communities via the groundwater, soil, and air. But determining the concentrations and direct effects of the contaminants on residents in the nearby at-risk areas has proven to be more difficult. Though it's been nearly 40 years since the Superfund declaration, there have been no epidemiological studies completed to determine if this waste has negatively impacted human health. And in 2004, when a group called Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste, or CCAT, pressed the EPA on completing a study, they were told they should survey health problems in a community themselves and submit the data to the CDC for consideration. To the possible surprise of regulators, CCAT did in fact conduct their own grassroots health survey. And surveying 239 residents in Lincoln Park, they found a higher than expected number of birth defects, specifically Pierre-Robin sequence, a condition resulting in an underdeveloped jaw, airway obstruction, and cleft palate, and Alagille syndrome, a disorder caused by genetic mutations that affects multiple organ systems and has a roughly 17% mortality rate. The prevalence of Alagille syndrome in a healthy population is estimated to be 1 in 70,000, Among the 239 residents CCAT surveyed, they found one case. But the parents of that affected child spoke of 5 other families they knew from the same area that also had children born with Alagille syndrome, though they were either not surveyed or had since moved to pursue better healthcare options. In terms of cancers, chronic low-dose radiation can cause or contribute to a variety of them, most notably non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The results of the survey when it came to cancers were largely anecdotal. There were reports of multiple individuals being diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or similar cancers that lived on the same streets or blocks, and there was a higher rate of cancer diagnoses in teachers in nearby grade schools. But given the limited health resources in Cañon City, they too had either moved away to seek higher quality treatment or had already died. Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste submitted their findings to the Centers for Disease Control in 2004, and the CDC tasked the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry with completing a public health assessment. And 6 years later, in 2010, the ATSDR released their assessment. They concluded that drinking water from private wells could harm people's health, not due to an elevated uranium concentration, but molybdenum. They also found that there was no risk to human health from the soil and areas surrounding the mill, and that the air quality was within federal annual dose limits. But some of these conclusions were on shaky ground to start. Instead of gathering all of the samples themselves, the ATSDR used soil and sediment testing data that was prepared by the Cotter Corporation, and they also didn't complete any actual epidemiological study, only focusing on the pathways of potential human exposure coupled with Cotter-reported levels of environmental contamination. As an important side note, the EPA has implicitly withdrawn support for this study as recently as October 2023, referring to the data and the study's findings as inadequate.
The existing data, based on the review of all the historical data, it's been determined that it's not quite adequate for identifying COPCs and COPECs.
But as we'll see in a moment, Cotter had nearly 30 years earlier already proven themselves to be a wholly unreliable source of environmental data. Throughout the entire existence of this mill, there were some at the Cotter Corporation that had a greater knowledge of the dangers the mill and its waste posed to workers and nearby communities. Unfortunately, those in charge found it wasn't in their best financial interest to look out for the community's well-being. From the very beginning, the Cotter Corporation had shown willingness to cut corners and flaunt regulations wherever convenient and financially advantageous. For example, within just the first decade of operation, the Atomic Energy Commission cited Cotter for air quality violations and failure to track radioactive releases 18 times. And when the Colorado Department of Health took over regulatory oversight in 1968, they cited Cotter 82 separate times for a variety of violations from 1968 to 1984. Violations like repeated leaks and spills of radioactive material, exceeding particulate emissions, and poor record keeping of groundwater contamination. But in 1979, the former chief chemist of the mill, a man named Lynn Boughton, contacted the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Boughton, who had resigned earlier that year, informed the CBI that Cotter's management had been doing more than just sidestepping regulations and cutting corners. They had, for at least a decade, been actively engaged in potentially criminal activity. The CBI's investigation revealed the Cotter Corporation had repeatedly exposed mill workers to excessive radioactivity and actively covered it up. From 1968 to 1978, Cotter had been falsifying their occupational health reports of workers, in some cases completely fabricating data, in order to appear in compliance with regulations. In the case of a sample testing higher than the limit, they would wash it down, resample it, and retest it until it came up lower. And if it didn't come up lower, they would simply throw the data away. He further alleged that the mill manager, a man named Miles Fixman, had ordered the data manipulation on at least 2 occasions in order to fool state regulators during their scheduled inspections. Inspections that Cotter was warned about and prepared for in advance. Meanwhile, workers at the mill were repeatedly exposed to significantly higher levels of airborne radiation than they reported. This attempt by Cotter's management to avoid lawsuits and costly modifications came at the direct and, in some cases, ultimately fatal expense of mill workers. But throughout all the years of Cotter's embattlements and feigned compliance with state and federal regulators, some residents had been following along, taking special notice of the effects the creeping waste and bureaucratic roadblocks were having in their community. And in the early 2000s, they turned that passive attention into active involvement. In 2002, the local activist group Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste, or CCAT, was formed. Since its formation, CCAT's goal has been to educate the community on the potential dangers of the uranium industry and to work with all levels of government to increase awareness of sites like the Cotter Uranium Mill and introduce legislation to prevent situations like this one from happening again anywhere else. And roughly a decade later, the Community Advisory Group, or CAG, was formed in Cañon City with similar goals. But unlike CCAT, the Community Advisory Group is supported by and works directly with state and federal regulators. Both groups are made up of local volunteers that work to keep the community informed, keep cleanup efforts moving forward, and keep the pressure on regulators and site operators to do what they claim they're going to do. Despite the increase in public pressure, Cotter remained undeterred in their quest to cut corners wherever they could, regardless of the effects their actions, or lack thereof, had on human health and the environment, and their lack of regard would become even more apparent in the years to come. Throughout the 2000s, Cotter was repeatedly cited for violating dozens of state regulations. For example, in 2000, they were cited for 15 violations, including once again exposing workers to unsafe levels of radioactivity. In 2001, they were cited with 7 violations and ordered to pay out $16.3 million to 32 people who experienced radiation poisoning. In 2002, Cotter was cited with 19 violations, with the state referring to many of these as a, quote, serious and substantial breakdown in management oversight. In 2004, the state of Colorado completed an assessment of the impoundment linings, finding them to be ineffective and, quote, unusable. That same year, Cotter spilled over 1,400 pounds of corrosive chemicals. 2005, Cotter was cited for 6 violations and was criminally charged for spilling 4,500 gallons of solvents which killed 40 geese and ducks. They would eventually plead guilty and were sentenced to pay a $15,000 fine. 2006, Cotter is cited for 7 violations, and the air quality test doubled the legal limit of contaminants. That same year, Cotter spills over 500 gallons of radioactive material 5 separate times. And these are just a few examples of violations within the first half of the 2000s. As a result of the 2002 violations, the state, for the first time since Cotter's opening, suspended Cotter's radioactive materials license. But it wasn't to last. Within a year, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment had not only lifted the license suspension, but renewed Cotter's license. And the state did so with the full knowledge of Cotter's proven record of chronic negligence and seeming inability to consistently operate within any sort of regulatory framework, even when it cost people their health and their lives. In 2006, after years of dwindling viability and mounting costs, Cotter began to tear down their on-site processing equipment and facilities. But rather than shipping all the mountains of waste from Demolition, they opted to dump some of that equipment directly into the impoundments, treating them like a landfill, resulting in sharp metal tearing additional holes in already leaky linings. In what may have been a last-ditch effort to turn the site profitable, Cotter requested permission from the state to perform heap leaching, a form of metal extraction similar to what they were previously doing but on a larger scale and with open-air impoundments, a process that would serve only to benefit Cotter's bottom line while further poisoning everything around them. But this effort would soon be shut down, thanks in large part to new legislation introduced with the help of Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste. So instead, Cotter decided that rather than trying to make any money, they would stop spending any. They openly refused to continue mandatory radon testing and dumped additional toxic waste into leaking impoundments. They even requested that the state allow them to stop testing the ponds, claiming it to be unsafe since the only walkway they had constructed over the waste was made up of rotting wooden pallets. And rather than recommending they construct a structurally sound walkway, the state approved their request, allowing Cotter to stop testing entirely. In 2011, trichloroethylene, or TCE, a highly toxic carcinogenic chemical, was found in 4 wells near the site, along with unsafe levels of uranium and molybdenum. The state required them to propose a plan to clean it up and monitor the levels. In a letter to the state, the EPA blasted Cotter's proposed plan as insufficient, stating that it doesn't, quote, contain what would normally be considered an acceptable level of detail. That same day, Colorado officials approved Cotter's proposal as is. But without the ability to capitalize on the land and its waste, the site had fully become to Cotter what it had been all along to the people living next to it, a liability. And while they still had an obligation under law to maintain and clean up the site, Cotter had no intention of finishing that job themselves. Instead, they would devise a plan to shift their responsibilities to another company. But these new owners weren't exactly who they claimed to be. In 2018, Cotter transferred their land and their radioactive materials license to a company called Colorado Legacy Land, or CLL. In taking ownership of the land, CLL took over all of Cotter's obligations, effectively assuming legal liability and regulatory risk on their behalf. Just like Cotter before them, CLL was now the responsible party when it came to continuing the remediation process while keeping the site in compliance with the license. The transaction between Cotter and CLL was an incredibly complex and, unfortunately, private one. All that's publicly known is that Cotter paid CLL to take the site, its liabilities, and its obligations off their hands. What's not publicly known is how much was paid and where some of that money went. But the history of Colorado Legacy Land was curious, to say the least. As a matter of fact, Colorado Legacy Land didn't have a history. CLL didn't exist prior to 2018. It was created by 2 companies, Legacy Land Stewardship and Alexco Environmental Group, and the sole purpose of CLL's creation was to take over 2 Cotter contamination sites, the Cotter Lincoln Park Superfund being one, and the other being the Schwarzwälder uranium mine about 140 miles to the north, just northwest of Golden, Colorado. But why would somebody form a company with its only goal being to swoop in and take over contaminated land that not only carries with it massive ongoing liabilities, but faces constant state and federal regulatory scrutiny? To best understand how this deal happened and take a guess at why, we need to understand what both of these companies claim to do. Legacy Land Stewardship is a real estate company classified as a public benefit corporation, with the stated mission of providing, quote, secure divestment solutions to owners of surplus, environmentally impacted real estate that responsibly and permanently delivers sustainable, long-term environmental stewardship and seeks eco-friendly reuses for public benefit. They market themselves as the perfect solution for companies that own toxic land with no redevelopment value that, among other reasons, is held merely to control future reuse and/or manage liability risk. Alexco Environmental Group, on the other hand, now known as Insero Solutions as of 2020, is an environmental consulting and remediation business that specializes in environmental assessments, permitting, restoration services, site operations, and essentially all labor and site administration surrounding environmental cleanup projects. At the helm of Insero Solutions is its CEO, Jim Harrington, who, along with other former Alexco management, bought themselves out from under their parent company, Alexco Resource Group, in 2020. But this is where things start to get uncomfortably suspicious. Insero Solutions was contracted by Colorado Legacy Land, a company Insero partially owns, to carry out the actual work on the site. But the man whose job it was to manage those contracts and the man who runs the company that received them are the same man, Jim Harrington. Harrington was on both sides of the same transaction, being the managing director of CLL and the CEO of Insero. For 5 years, From 2018 to 2023, CLL paid Insero to carry out work on the site. The average cost just to minimally maintain the site is roughly $150,000 monthly, and that's not including regulatory costs or any additional work required to fix and clean up the numerous toxic waste leaks that have occurred over the years. But this arrangement, as bad as it looked on the surface, was about to get even uglier.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight for our monthly CAG meeting. And we are going to have a departure from our normal agenda trajectory this evening. We have some news to share. And that news is that late last week, CLL informed EPA and CDPHE that the company was financially insolvent and would be unable to fulfill its obligations under the CERCLA RIFS AOC and the radioactive materials license.
In February 2023, Harrington declared CLL insolvent, claiming they were unable to fulfill their obligations under CERCLA. By the end of March, they had completely pulled out of all on-site operations and administration. Colorado Legacy Land, the public benefit corporation that had promised to be the permanent, responsible, and sustainable solution for the cleanup at the Cotter Superfund Site, had proven to be none of those. Instead, CLL had, as one community leader put it, dropped the keys in the parking lot, abandoning the site, their obligations, and the community. In the months leading up to CLL's insolvency, Harrington claimed he no longer had a working relationship with the owners of Legacy Land Stewardship, the company Insero shares ownership of CLL with, implying he is effectively the last man standing. But Colorado Legacy Land, as an entity, still owns the land itself, while Legacy Land Stewardship has all but disappeared off the map. That is, except for one office, located in this building behind me, which happens to share the same address and suite number as one of Insero's offices. So Insero and Legacy Land Stewardship share, at a minimum, a lease agreement and a mailbox. And it's important to be perfectly clear here. Nobody's accusing CLL, Insero, or even Jim Harrington of any specific wrongdoing, criminal or otherwise. But the situation has created some serious discomfort and suspicion among Cañon City residents. And that suspicion can be calmed with even a moderate amount of transparency into the true nature of the relationship between Insero and CLL, transparency that Harrington has yet to provide. So I contacted Jim Harrington directly to provide him the opportunity to comment on the situation and clear up any potential confusion or misunderstanding. And while I did receive a response from him, in which he asked me to clarify my intentions, he ultimately stopped responding altogether. However, I did come away from that exchange with one minor, if not interesting, piece of information. I sent an email to two of Jim Harrington's known email addresses, one at Insero and one at CLL. But he only replied from one, his Colorado Legacy Land email account. The limited transparency into the relationship between Colorado Legacy Land and Insero and the handling of the money CLL received from Cotter has prompted some community members to escalate the issue, calling on the Colorado Attorney General to investigate a potential conflict of interest. And in a monthly meeting with the Community Advisory Group, Assistant Attorney General Shelley Hickerson attempted to address the concerns. In the June 2023 meeting, Hickerson claimed that she understands the discomfort surrounding the circumstances of CLL's insolvency and Harrington's roles with both companies, but stated that it seems unlikely that there would be a benefit to Harrington making the decision to leave the site. However, when a community member asked about the relationship between Alexco Environmental Group, which had turned into Insero in 2020, and Colorado Legacy Land, Hickerson's response was alarming.
I got a question, and my question would be, it appears to me in research online that Insero is what sort of became a Alexco Environmental Group US, which was part of Legacy CLL. And given that CLL has a current notice of apparent violation against them, I'm confused as to why that's not perceived as a conflict of interest, and why that's not perceived as a problem.
So CLL and Insero are two separate companies.
And as I've said, the relationship between the two of them, the perception of the conflict of interest is not being denied, or the overlap there is not being denied.
I just want to make a comment that seems that if a company changes its name because of a corporate merger, that they therefore slip out of responsibility for being part of a company which defaulted.
I might not be understanding that particular issue with respect to the first company that you mentioned that Ensero turned into, but I do know that CLL and Ensero are two separate corporate entities, although they do have a corporate officer in common. That's not illegal.
What I'm saying is that Alexco Environmental Group US was one of the original partners in CLL, and it seems like it's just a changing of the names. And as you change your name, you can avoid responsibility, in my opinion.
I'm not familiar with that corporate chain of events that you described, but if part of it was reacquired by a new company, it's still a
Secretary of State's website. I just wanted to be on the record.
okay.
Following those comments, Hickerson clarified that she only represents the Radioactive Control Program, and their obligation is to ensure that a licensee, in this case Colorado Legacy Land, maintains an adequate financial assurance to continue work on a site. But Hickerson's comment, when taken in context with her admission of having no knowledge of Ensero's corporate history, implies that the reason they aren't looking into the transaction between Cotter and CLL and where that money went is because, simply put, it's not their job. And while that may seem reasonable on the surface, the details of that transaction, and even more specifically how that money was handled by Harrington as both managing director of CLL and CEO of Ensero, is undeniably related to CLL's eventual insolvency. In the meeting, Hickerson also said there doesn't appear to be a benefit for Harrington to have declared CLL insolvent, since the bond funding CLL's work was called by the state, an amount of money that was very close to the amount the state collected from CLL as collateral. But Ensero already collected 5 years' worth of contracting revenue from CLL. The money switched hands from a partially responsible party with legal liability under CERCLA to a company with no liability. Two companies run by the same person. When these types of holes start accumulating in a story, a new kind of pattern begins to emerge. And this pattern makes it appear as though Colorado Legacy Land was created for the sole purpose of absorbing legal liability on behalf of one of their founders and owners, Ensero. In this scenario, CLL would exist purely to act as a sort of filter, allowing money to pass through CLL to Ensero, while CLL absorbs the legal liability and regulatory risk on their behalf. And even when CLL went under, Ensero continued to profit, securing an interim contract with the state of Colorado for at least 1 year. And they did so all without any legal liability, all while owning the insolvent company that is legally liable, and all while being run by the same man. Now, this is an observation, not an accusation. But even with the details we know for certain, the Assistant Attorney General cannot claim there to be no reason to, at the very least, dig a little deeper into the relationship between Ensero and CLL. That is, without being either willfully short-sighted or lying. Since Colorado Legacy Land is out, the EPA and Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment are forcing the Cotter Corporation back in, ordering them to return and fulfill their obligations under CERCLA. Ensero's interim contract with the state expires at the end of April 2024, and sometime before then, Cotter will need to find an environmental contractor to perform the work legally required of them. But if the state truly explored every option and every possible outcome of those options and still kept Ensero on as a contractor in the interim, there is a very real possibility that Cotter will do the same. A possibility that has some community members worried, and one that, without increased transparency, would only further undermine the public's trust in all parties involved. If that's the case, Ensero could continue getting contracts on the Cotter site indefinitely without any legal liability under CERCLA, while at the same time owning the company that is legally liable, A situation that not only benefits Insero, but could possibly have been engineered by them in the first place. So what's next for the Cotter Superfund Site and the Lincoln Park and Cañon City communities? Where is this tangled web of broken bureaucracy and suspicious financial dealings leading? Well, while Insero is still minimally maintaining the site, at least at the time of filming this in September 2023, the EPA has made it clear that Cotter has a legal obligation under CERCLA to return and finish the job. But can Cotter be trusted to cooperate and follow through on remediation? And will regulators hold them accountable? With Cotter's history of litigiously dodging any and all responsibility and regulators' track records of being relatively toothless, there is no doubt this will continue to be an uphill battle. Thankfully, there are some consistently vocal and steadfast people here, like those in the Community Advisory Group and Colorado Citizens Against Toxic Waste, and they fully intend to keep fighting, pushing the parties responsible and those regulating the parties responsible toward action and measurable improvement. And look, it's not lost on anybody that this process will continue on for many, many more years, decades even, likely outliving some of those who have devoted decades of their lives to this already. But if their continued efforts can even remotely help to secure a safer and healthier community for younger generations and the generations to come, then it will continue to be a battle worth fighting.